was hard for me to accept stereotypes growing up. I think partially because I was the kind of kid who questioned everything. And I also grew up around a lot of civil rights leaders, so as long as I can remember, I've been hearing stories about things like desegregation, integration, equality, civil disobedience. So I remember being about 6 years old and looking up at my grandmother and asking her, why is it that my male cousins can go outside and play football on Sunday while the female cousins have to stay inside and learn how to cook? Well, my grandmother, being the woman that she was, said, go right ahead, go outside and play football. So I'd go out and play. Occasionally I'd play barefoot. Sometimes I'd play in hard church shoes. But after a couple rough tackles and some crushed toes, I think I decided maybe I'll reconsider and go back to the norm. Well, by the time I rejoined the group, I'm blaming this for being the reason that I never learned how to cook. She and I decided that it might be better if I focused on my writing instead. So in a way, I guess I can blame stereotypes or give stereotypes credit for being a writer at an early age. And I've contributed to some form of publication probably since about age 16. And what I like to write about the most is about history. I've researched African American history, African history, European history, all types of blended amounts of history. And one of the places that I've done that has been here. So I think it's interesting that we're actually having the TEDx talk in this box. I spent quite a few times researching things like bills of sales for ancestors who, in this very place, were treated like real estate. And it was during a time when society said it was okay to sell humans like it was property. It was legally and socially upheld. So being here in this very place affirms my commitment to question the boxes, even when society says it's okay, to really ask yourself, is this acceptable to discriminate? So discrimination isn't just unique to African American culture or my gender. As I did some research about discrimination, I thought how interesting. It's been going on since the beginning of time. And I ran across a quote that I'd like to share from an Australian author by the name of Nick Vujicic. He is the founder of a ministry called Life Without Limbs, and he has an amazing story. He is actually unstoppable. He was born without limbs, and he never complains. He talks about finding a healthy, happy, fulfilled life. But this is what he says about stereotypes. If we went by the world's definition of who I'm supposed to be because I look weird, we would say, well, surely this guy can't have a productive life. Surely he doesn't have a sense of humor. Surely he can't love life. We stereotype people in this world. And so if the world thinks that you're not good enough, get a second opinion. I think it's interesting that all over the world, we've somewhat accepted that stereotypes exist, but I have a hard time finding anybody who wants to claim them. I think there's this fear that we're going to be called a bigot, a phobic, or maybe some dirty word that ends in IST. So if it makes everybody feel better, I want to be the first person to raise my hand. I still stereotype, and I probably do it on a regular basis. I have to share this very funny story. Those of you who know me will know who I'm talking about. I met a friend here, we hit it off immediately. She is part of the reason why I can buy into the stereotypes that maybe blondes do have more fun. So she invited me. I thought she was the most open and creative person I'd ever met in my entire life, until she gave me her address for dinner. I found out that she lives in a town called Denton. Well, for those of you who don't know about Denton, I grew up hearing horror stories about racist acts in Denton. I was terrified. In fact, my family used to just make jokes and threats and say, if you don't behave, we're going to drop you off in Denton. So I had a little bit of a problem. No matter how cool I thought she was, I had a little bit of a problem getting in the car and driving out to Denton. But I did it. And chills went through my bones as I crossed over the city limits. And I'm glad that I did. Her home has lovingly been called the ranch by so many of my girlfriends, and I have been nursed back to health there. So I'm thankful for being able to overcome that stereotype, but I still do it. So just because I'm giving this talk doesn't mean that I don't have stereotypes. In fact, my research teaches me that stereotypes actually begins from the time that we're processing information. Psychologists use a term, and I learned this in Psychology 101, but psychologists use a term called schemas. In psychology, a schema is an organized pattern that categorizes information and relationships among them. It can also be described as a mental structure of preconceived ideas, a framework representing some aspect of the world, a system organizing and perceiving new information. Now that doesn't sound so bad, does it? It's how we all start as children. We believe what the adults in our lives teach us. One study showed that a young lady was introduced to a horse. She was told by the adults in her life that a horse is large. A horse has hair, a horse has legs, a horse has a tail. So when she was introduced to a cow, naturally she thought it was a horse. That fits within her schema. After all, that creature also is large. It has legs, it has a tail. So once she learned that there was a different animal called a cow, she had to adjust her schema again. Now the study, I won't go on, really, really complicates things. Then they introduced this poor child to a miniature horse. Totally blows her schema. But it shows you that this is our way as humans of processing information. So I want us to relax a little bit about some of these other terms and labels and realize that we all begin processing information the same. We create boxes for reasons. And they are necessary because there's no way we could take in all of the daily information. We really can't question absolutely everything. So as we grow older, we're supposed to adjust and adapt to new schemas. So schemas actually do become stereotypes. And that's when we allow this mental framework to exclude pertinent information. And we only hear what fits within the context of our bias. If we're unwilling to change what we believe about people or things, then we stereotype. And then if we take that information and we act on it, we may be discriminating or producing bias. So if we go back to the schema with the little girl, then think about if she decided that she refuses to believe that a miniature horse could actually be a horse. And then what if she decided that she didn't want to feed that horse because she thought it was ugly, or she thought it was weird, or she thought it was undeserving? Then that would mean she would be acting in a way of bias. So now that we're on the same page and we understand, we all begin with schemas. This is how we process information. They can lead to stereotypes, and dare I say it, stereotypes can lead to prejudice. So the question here is what's next? Where do we go from here? My thought is that if we as a community can't talk about or address discrimination, then we're probably not going to do anything about it. For instance, the UNC Center for Civil Rights did a study about Davidson County. Now, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about this study, but it basically is an in-depth analysis on the legacy of segregation and its impact on things including affordable housing, public education, political representation. The study concludes, the deep divide in Davidson County suggests solutions that sound simple but will not be easy. Limited and geographically concentrated access to affordable housing, schools, districts, race are based on race and class. Proposing solutions will require building the political will to challenge these entrenched divides and power structures. So we're not going to do all that today, which is good news because we're going to get out of here early. But what we can do is begin being honest about stereotypes without getting in trouble. And I think, again, if we go back to this mental process, this is where we begin our change. So most people at this point would be wondering, what do we do? What do we do about bias? Well, let me just begin by saying I think you start with introspection. I recognize now that my stubborn unwillingness to accept boxes has proven to be one of my greatest assets in life. And I'll tell you that as a young African-American woman, I statistically know that growing up on public assistance meant that I wasn't supposed to be smart or articulate. Statistically, I know that as a daughter of a cafeteria worker who had an 8th grade education, that I wasn't supposed to be in the top of my class. So some of you might know that I was in the inaugural group for a program called Project Potential. We were selected based on the fact that we had high academic scores, but that we received free and reduced lunch. So I watched this group of young people go from 10 to 8 and 5. Some people became teen mothers, some dropped out of school for work reasons, others faced this peer pressure that said, you can't be cool and academically gifted. So I became friends on the bus with one young man. and he helped me with my math homework. He was bright, could have been a mathematician, but I watched life suck the brightness out of his eyes. I remember finding out that he dropped out of school, and his desire for popularity and fast cash drowned out his dreams for a college education. But I saw him on the block one day, and I stopped, and I said, "What are you doing here? Get back to school." As hardcore as he was with his friends on the street, he was terrified about stepping outside the box. After all, this was how he'd seen the men in his life and generation survive. I remember the last conversation that I had with him, and finally I said, "I'm just giving up on you." A few years later, when I returned back home for work, the newspaper did a story. So I received a letter from a correctional facility. My friend had came across the story and wrote to me, 6 pages later and a whole lot of regrets. I'll never forget his last words. He said, "I remember our talk. You said you gave up. Is it too late?" So I share this not because I think that everyone's going to prison because of stereotypes, but I have found that most people do have a level of confinement of their own. Think about it. Before society told you who you were to become, you had a dream. But from the time you were born, we've been trying to figure you out and put you in a box. So I have a great deal of respect for this growing sentiment among young people. I can't believe that I'm admitting this. So I've been watching interviews with Miley Cyrus and Willow Smith and Raven-Symoné, and all of them are saying the same thing. They don't want to be labeled. And I watch them for this very reason. I'm encouraged by their willingness to lead the conversation. Even if I don't understand all the shackles that they seek to be freed from, I'm still encouraged by their willingness to start this talk. So my revolutionary thought is that you can eliminate discrimination just by sitting down with yourself. My first recommendation, in fact, is that the best way to impact stereotypes is about thinking about how they make you feel. Secondly, make a choice. Now, you have the right and the freedom to continue on in your bias. No one is going to come and arrest you for taking a mental shortcut. But whether out of convenience, ignorance, or hate, just know the harmful result could be the same. Now, if that bothers your conscience, then it might require you exercising your mind. Schemas really are a natural way of thinking. But in order to avoid stereotypes, it might require you slowing down this judgment process. After learning about this behavioral pattern, I even began to ask myself, are my gut feelings about people valid, or are they based on bias? You also need to seek out different cultures. Now, I'm excited about looking out in this room. As a student in Lexington City Schools, I was really thankful for the opportunity that we have to have real and true and genuine relationships with people from other cultures. I look back and I think about my parents' generation. Although they were a part of desegregation, there were still some very real and unofficial boundaries when it came to relationships. And we did make strides in my generation to cross those boundaries, but I am encouraged by seeing the next generation take that to a whole new level. So I would encourage you to continue to step outside of your routines, which might mean encountering and trying to understand people from a different culture. And then I want to include that travel and education and exposure has been great for me. I am embarrassed somewhat to tell this story because I was an African American Studies major when I went to South Africa for the first time. So I got off the plane in 1996 and realized that everybody had a cell phone and they were speaking British English. Now, I've read a lot about Africa. I thought I knew a lot about the continent. I definitely thought I knew a lot about the country of South Africa. But I joked around with my friends when I got there and I said, I really didn't expect this. So I'll say that traveling has been very important to me. Before then, I really thought about it, and my stereotype about South Africa had been based on 2 things: National Geographic and Coming to America. So I'm glad I actually got out of the country. Now my South African friends and I can joke about that. It seems like our best opportunities to influence and change widely held schemas will ultimately come through our interpersonal relationships. And finally, I would encourage you to raise awareness. If the box bothers you, and I'll say that again, if the box bothers you, then I would say you have a responsibility to do something about it. Now, the box of exclusion bothers me, so you know how I've responded. I've shared with you examples of my own personal activism. But I will say that there are some larger institutional concerns in our community that we can't easily resolve. So what can you do? They aren't going to magically disappear, and they certainly aren't if we aren't willing to talk about them. But I like being a revolutionary, and I know that that's not for everyone. So I would challenge you to say if raising awareness comes through social media, then you should do that. And contrary to popular belief, I think that can be very effective. I'm not expecting everyone to leave this presentation and plan a march or become an activist, and I know in some ways we all will still stereotype. But it is my hope that you hear something in these talks today that inspires you to think differently. If you aren't ready to run out and save the world just yet, that's okay. Maybe just start with the courage to begin by freeing yourself from the box that stereotypes build. Thank you.